You're live now. I'd love to see it. A big red sort of modal pops up. Okay, that's fantastic stuff. Folks, welcome to the first of a series of webinars that I'm going to be running with our friends at Figures. Really excited to do this series because I think we do need to have a stop and review as to what the heck's been going on with compensation in the market over the last period of time. I think anybody who's involved in HR or recruiting or hiring, or even if you're a job seeker on the market, it's always very, very important to understand where exactly the market is going when it comes to compensation for candidates. And we've got a 3-part series, folks, where we're going to try and touch on some of these areas that have changed over the last 12 months. This is the first episode. And we're going to do the big high level. So this is the comparison, the differences in compensation between 2022 and 2023. And we're going to just have a look to see what the impact of inflation has been, what the big tech winter has sort of done to compensation, what the candidate crisis, where there's still shortage of labor, what has that done to compensation. So if you're interested in this topic, you are in the right place. Folks, before we kick off, just want to make sure whether everyone can hear us okay. I think this is kind of a newish product that I've never used before, so I want to make sure everyone can hear us fine. Make sure you make use of the chat features, by the way, folks. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see your nav bar, so feel free to chat to us on there and chat to each other also. We should get a few polls running as well, which should give you some ability to give your input on the topics we'll be discussing, so keep an eye out on that. And of course, if you have any questions for either myself, Virgil, or Neil, go ahead and ask them in chat. Okay, cool. Looks like people can hear us all good. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Elodie. Thank you, Emma. Great stuff. Let's do some intros to kick off with. Let's go left to right. Neil, I can see you on my far left. So can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
That's rare enough for me to be on the far left of anything, Hung. Hello, my name's Neil Carberry. I am the Chief Executive of the REC, the Recruitment and Employment Confederation in the UK. But for these purposes, I'm also, I'm going to say, maybe not Premier League, but Championship level British pay geek. I spent almost a decade on the Low Pay Commission setting the minimum wage in the UK, and indeed last night wrote an article about pay setting in the UK. So we are on my specialist subject, Hung.
Indeed. So this is the mastermind subject for Neil Carberry. You know, if you have this show where you live, you know, where you have a guy interviewing on a nerd topic, pay is what Neil cares about. Actually, Neil, you're getting increasingly famous. I've seen you on TV now. So it's becoming a point where suddenly, I know this guy.
Recruiters are stars. We know that.
That's it. And Neil Carberry is joining us for this show. So you're in good company, everybody. Okay, we have Virgil. Virgil, can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Yep, of course. So if Neil is championship level, what am I? Amateur league, Sunday league level? I don't know. I'm Virgil. I wish, Neil. I'm Virgil. I'm CEO and co-founder of Figures. So I've been working in HR for 11 years, and I have no side there. I've been doing recruiting. I've been doing HR business partner, and I've been doing compensation before creating Figures. And Figures, we're a compensation management platform. We help companies master their compensation policy. And we have one of our bricks that we're going to use today is a compensation benchmarking, right? We aggregate data from more than 1,200 companies. And we're going to use some of the data we have aggregated during today's webinar. We're going to share some of the insights. But we're also much more than that. We help companies define, create, and share their salary bands, which is going to be bigger and bigger as we go along with pay transparency laws on the horizon. And then we help companies run compensation reviews at scale too. And that's it.
Yeah, fascinating service. And I think it will be a mandatory service in time. It's one of those categories, compensation tech and interview intelligence. Those are the two of my sort of mini parts of the process that I think have suddenly become really important categories. And I do believe they'll become mandatory in time, whether you use a service like Figures or it will be some sort of internal build somewhere with a core system that you have. point is, you can't really talk about pay equity. You can't talk about being competitive salary pay without having access to data. And the previous ways in which we've been accessing data through job ads or something, or through just casual interviews, it doesn't give us the fidelity to really construct the sort of packages that are fair but also attractive and competitive in the wider market. So make sure you check out Figures. It's one of the leading products out there. Okay. By the way, before we jump into the conversation, Veja, I just want to check. You've got some data to show. Like, do you know when you want to show that? Because I'm happy to lead with this, or do you want to drop it in later on in the conversation?
I don't have any slides planned for it. I can write those data back on the whiteboard, right? It's a new era. We are talking about a new era in 2023, especially in the startup world, right? We have to go back to basics. Money is running out. Yeah,
that's it. At least you know it's authentic, folks. You've actually got the CEO of Figures drawing on it with a Sharpie on a whiteboard. This is true. This is real data.
Fabian Gauthier of HR.
That's it. No, let's take the high level. Let's talk about the cost of living crisis that I think is on everyone's minds. Like, it's one of those topics which I think, nobody really is untouched by this. You simply have to go and shop in the market, in a supermarket. You will know that the cost of living has increased. So this has really hit everyone in their pockets. It's basically meant that the cost of living is increased, and our wages typically have not. I mean, they don't increase 11 times in a row, or dozens of times in a row, as inflation has, or as the interest rate has. So let's talk about that and the overall impact and how that's driven workers' compensation. Neil, let's go to you first. Cost of living crisis, we've been feeling this now for 18 months or so, maybe even a bit longer. What is the overall sort of impact in terms of how that's stimulated people's agitation for increased wages?
Well, I think, Hung, you are absolutely right to cast back to the financial crisis of 2008 in terms of where this has come from. Because one of the things that surprised everybody then, certainly in the UK market, but I think we saw in lots of markets around Europe and North America, was the preservation of work at the loss of pay. So we kept people in work, and the deal, whether it was collectively bargained with unions or unspoken, as it was largely in the UK, was we're going to constrain pay for a bit. Unfortunately, for a bit turned out to be 13 years. And in the private sector, pay did pick up, and it's toddled along. It's never been rising much in real terms, which is the traditional experience in the UK. UK, by comparison with other countries, has quite a large labour share of income going to wages. Don't believe what people tell you about Britain being a low-paid country. Has some low-paid people, but the pay generally is performance has been pretty good over the last 20 years. That particularly bit in the public sector, where wages are well below in real terms where they were in 2007. Now, what's the oil of that? The oil of that is money being free. So one of the responses to the 2008 crash was a crash in interest rates to keep economies going. If you are a worker and you've got access to loads of 0% credit card deals, you have more elbow room to manage low pay increases and inflation than you would in a normal economic environment. Now, what we've had for the last year is kind of a rapid return to normality, where interest rates have returned to the sorts of levels we were used to for decades and decades before, and people's cost base has shifted appropriately. It's no surprise, therefore, that suddenly people are thinking, actually, I need to earn more. Then you layer on the pandemic to that. So I need to earn more. And how do I earn more? I change jobs. So you have this massive activity in 2022 in labor, in 2021 in labor markets around the world, with people changing jobs. And one of the drivers is I want to earn more. It's not just, I want to work somewhere with beanbags. Ultimately, work is a transaction. We do it for the money. Meaning is important as well.
Quick interlude, Neil. Quick interlude. By the way, to the audience, right, that basically the way you basically increase significantly if you move jobs rather than stay in jobs and be promoted. Everyone knows this, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges, Hung, with the younger generation who came into the workforce post 2007 is they didn't change jobs enough in their 20s because they were very, very cautious. So it's exactly that point.
Quick one, final one. To the audience, did you change your job in 2021? Did you take advantage of the crazy buoyancy in Switch? I think a lot of recruiters did, and they're smart to do it because they were getting 20%, 30% increases, crazy numbers being thrown out. Remember, I'll never forget this chart. LinkedIn rolled out the most in-demand job on their entire platform was recruiter. It was a hockey-shaped curve like this, and this was May 2021. So let me know in the chat whether you changed your job in that period, because if you did, kudos to you. I would say you probably took advantage of the market conditions and where the supply basically did not meet demand, and you were able to hopefully convert that into a high paying job. Sorry, Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and that thing about particularly drawing people into some of the tech businesses before the tech's crash, you know, where you're throwing jelly at the wall to see what takes off quickly. And then Paula's comment in the chat about hired and then laid off, not an unusual experience in over the last year or so. So you've got this situation where in 2021 and 2022, or particularly early 22, wages are being driven by the market, but that's one of two ways in which wages can be driven. They can be driven by the market or driven by the structure. And when I say driven by the structure, I'm talking about minimum wage. So a lot of the wage rise in the UK this year is a large minimum wage rise. But most importantly, it's about wage settlements. It's at what stage do you structure your internal wage to match the fact that the people you're hiring are now being paid more than the people you've got? And as you say, Hung, that tends to happen more slowly. But for me, pay setting, certainly in the UK, last year was all about the market driving wages up. This year, it's all about pay settlements in companies driving wages up. So we're talking 6 to 8% in most private sector companies in Britain, maybe a little bit more. That will fall away next year. But part of that is also the kind of equal pay law piece as well. If men are more likely than women to trade jobs for pay, you could be embedding some equal pay issues, which is why looking at your data is really important. So for me, I think we've had a year of the market really driving it. The market's cooled, but companies are catching up now because they need to protect their existing staff. I'm expecting 2024 to be the year where we see a real fall off in average pay awards back to the 3 to 4% out of the 6 to 8% we're seeing in the UK this year.
Folks, are you getting all of that? So just a very quick summary. I think the main insight I took from this was that 2021, lots of external hiring, competition for talent, etc. That increased the job, sort of the cost of employment for employers hiring externally. But once those folks were settled into the business, that resets the bar internally, because you're going to have to do something to retain the staff and bump them all up a little bit more. And that may have been what's been going on over this year. Go to you, Virgil. What's your take on that sort of narrative that Neil's just described for us? Does it comport with how you've seen the data on figures, or is there anything you'd like to add or potentially dispute with Neil's sort of view there?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of things that Neil has seen in the past few years, right? And one thing to keep in mind is most of our data coming from 1,200 companies are mostly on average tech companies, right? Something to keep in mind. And what we've seen, right, is after years, and especially, I'd say 2019 to 2021, crazy year-on-year growth of salaries, right? Things have cooled down a little bit last year. And in fact, last year was the first year in years that the average salary increases were below inflation rates, right? When we see the market movement, on average, inflation was higher than average salary increases in companies for the first time in years, right? So what we've seen on the market, first thing we've seen is when you look at average salary increases last year were around 6%, right? What we saw from companies for people like salary increase budget were around 6%, higher in the UK, a bit lower in like France, Germany, and so on, higher in the UK. Now we're currently running a survey on planned budget increases for the end of the year, right? It seems to cool off a little bit, so we're seeing 4 to 5% right now. It's just the beginning of the survey, but we've collected 90 answers from companies. So things are cooling down, right? I think last year, with inflation, there was a lot of requests to companies and from workers to be like, as Neil said, I want my compensation to go up, right? Money is not free anymore. Interest rates are going up. I I need my employer to take care of that cost of living crisis, right? So we saw those higher salary increases budget. This year is going down a little bit for sure. And then when we look at the market, like market salaries themselves, we see that cooling down as well, right? And how do we measure these figures? We think of the market and like the compensation market a bit like the housing market. If you want to see how the market is shifting, you can't only look at people's salaries at any given time. You need to look at recent transactions, right? So what we're doing, we're looking at people being hired right now, are hired in the past few weeks and the past few months. What are their rates at compared to what the people were hired at in the past few years, right? Not only people's salaries right now, but what are people hired at in terms of rates? Because as we mentioned, on average, to get a better salary increase, you need to move jobs twice as much, right? People who are moving jobs get at least twice as much. It's like around 2 to 2.4x than people staying on jobs. So we look at how much are people moving into jobs right now getting. And what we see is that overall, it's still a slight increase in salaries in all markets in Europe. Still increases in tech roles. And you mentioned that at the beginning, Han, but we still see an increase in tech roles. But for sales and support function, quite a different story. We see more of a stagnation, slight increase in sales role, stagnation in support function role. And stagnation with a high inflation rate means the market is clearly cooling down. Not for tech, and it won't be for a while. Tech folks will still have a premium. There's still a need for them, right? So still see salary increases, not at the same rate that they used to, but other roles, different story.
Let's talk about the sector side because it is really important, and I'll come back to where we are at on this, recruiters and HR people, because I do believe that we would fall into the category of business support function, and we probably have experienced, if not stagnation, and even a drop from peak of 2021. I think it is a drop. So actually, maybe that's a poll that's worth putting together. Nick, I wonder whether we could stick something up on that, just to say, look, has compensation for TA and recruiters kind of leveled off, increased, or actually gone down, objectively gone down in the course of the last 12 months? Why don't we stick a poll up there and we'll get everyone to vote on it and see what they think. I know, for instance, just as an anecdote, so the only thing I can produce to this conversation, unfortunately, is anecdata, right? So I beg your pardon on this. However, I know there's people who have basically taken lower salaries because of a reduction of opportunity that they've experienced in the recruiting space. And this is obviously internal recruiters in the main. And people have spent long time on the market, very, very skilled, experienced, talented people. Kind of unthinkable they'll be on the market for 6 months, 9 months, etc. You know what? At some point, you just have to compromise your circumstances because you can't just keep burning cash like that. And then you take a job that's actually 20% lower than you thought you would take. So I think this is starting to happen. Okay. Let's go back to what I was saying before that segue. Sectorally, where are we looking at? Neil, let's talk about, you talked about public and private before. So we know the general picture. Private's accelerated over the last free money era ahead of public, which hasn't accelerated this way. Actually, Virgile, I wonder whether you can say, what's the situation in France? Because I know public and private obviously is very country specific, but in the UK, I think it's widely accepted that the public sector have effectively had a pay cut for the last 10 years in a row. Is that the situation in France also, or have you guys kind of kept same thing?
Same thing, not as much as the UK though. Like in France, public sector salaries have been increasing at a slower pace than private sector salaries. Same thing in the UK, but I think the discrepancy is much higher in the UK than it seems to be in the private.
Yeah, and below the rate of inflation, obviously, which means that this is why we're seeing strike action, unionization, stuff like this, because it's the only way in which people are able to actually negotiate and get a better deal. Okay, let's talk aside from public and private, guys. Open to everyone. I don't want to direct it necessarily to Neil, but what do you think are the sectors that have been most insulated from the pressures downwards? In other words, it's still high premium. We've talked about tech already. What about the areas that basically are starting to have always had, where we've had the labor market crisis? Have we seen that go up? I'm thinking about people like nursing, hotel workers, construction people? Do we have any information about where pay is for those folks?
I'll give you a little bit to kick us off on. I would say that there are two basic areas which are insulated against a slowdown. One is in-demand skills. So I think that's now some of tech, not all of tech, as Virgil was saying. It's also things like heavy engineering in the UK, where pay growth remains relatively robust. I think healthcare is coming off a bit from where it was, which is just a function of the post-pandemic shakedown, but it's still relatively strong. But the big area is the hourly paid labour market. So if you think about hospitality, you think about logistics, you think about what in the US they'd call light industrial, sort of blue collar manufacturing. In those areas, we're seeing really strong pay pressure. And that is still, despite the fact that the economy's been off for a while now, that is still being driven basically by shortage, which you've heard this before, Hung, but my favourite fact is that there were 50% more babies born in the UK in 1964 than in 1977. And once you understand that, and the baby boomers being a big group of people who are now retiring, you understand some of that constriction in terms of labour supply in the UK. It's not, I mean, there's a little bit of Brexit in there, but actually it's demographics that are the major driver. So we're going to see, I think, things like consumer facing businesses who have relied for a long time on a low wage model can reconsider whether that lower wage model needs to be stepped up a bit. Which brings me to a core point, I think, for clients, if you're in internal TA talking to HR for your business, which is, of course, your compensation model is just derived demand. It's a derived demand of your business strategy. Your companies have choices about where they want to pitch themselves on a pay scale and a benefit scale. And I think we get locked in the political debate into what the kind of morally correct place to be is. The morally correct place to be is whatever suits your business strategy. Certainly, certain large international online retailers would say that one of the things they look for in moving into a local area is jobs for their people to move into, because they know they'll have a large swathe of low-paid workers, not all of whom can progress with them, and they won't stay on those wages forever. So that kind of thing about owning the strategy in your own hand matters as well, and that will change sector to sector.
I think this is a really important point, because the moral aspect, I think we're all moral beings, but at the same time, it's a very crude way to understand pay, because we can kind of inadvertently make erroneous conclusions on what should be done based on that morality. So, for instance, the gig working is a classic example. We always observe gig workers. It's kind of like it's flexible labor, it's low security, it's physical stuff, it's tough work, and it's not very highly paid. We all think, oh, that's terrible. And then if you think about it, that may be the case, but at the same time, most people who are doing Deliveroo or doing Uber even, they're not thinking about this necessarily as a career path, but sometimes it's just simply a job to just get started on somewhere. I mean, I do note, for instance, that a lot of these jobs are actually performed by people who may be recent immigrants into a country. And if you simply look at the rhetoric about immigration in various countries, in Europe and the US and so forth, there is a very clear hostility towards a lot of these people, in which case that's going to be a huge deterrent for them to get any other kind of work. So why are we trying to deprive them of the work that they can get? And I speak as a person that's come from an immigrant background. Yes, my parents worked in very tough labor market conditions, but they had to do it because there was no other option. So unless you're prepared to provide a better option, then we need to kind of reset where the morality is when it comes down to these things. Anyway, let's go to you on this, Virgil. From the data you've seen sectorally, what's like significant or remarkable in your view?
So one thing,
and I know, by the way, that the figures obviously is inherently a little bit skewed towards the technical side, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think, in fact, yeah, that's what I was about to say. I think I can speak a lot on the tech side of things and tech side of the market. But what's interesting, I've talked about the wages, right? So year on year, wages increase overall, but much smaller rate of increase than in years past. Still an increase on tech roles, support function, stagnation, potentially decrease on some roles, including recruiters, by the way. Talent acquisition, what we're seeing, clear decrease, even worse on the contractor side and some of the employee side. But what are we seeing on tech is when you zoom out of just purely the wages thing, is when you look at the total packages, you see changes in equity and benefits, right? If we start with equity, on the tech sector, it's like a huge shift. Public companies, publicly listed companies, most of the stocks went down. Most of the total compensation packages of tech workers are gone down. And in fact, for startup employees, tech startup employees, most of them have been given equity in the form of stock options. And most of them have seen the value of those stock options like plummet or to be even just nil right now, because a lot of people have received stock options in the tech industry whose strike price is above the actual value of the share, right? So that's a lot of the equity is not worth as much as it used to. And what's interesting is I think the level of education around equity and startup equity in Europe is still low enough that this hasn't led to dramatic waves of departures at some companies or dramatic shift in hiring capacity for companies. When I talk to a lot of companies over the US, we have some companies that have seen waves of departure because employees were like, you know what, my equity is worth nothing. My stock options are underwater because they're not worth anything anymore. I'm going to leave. So they had to take plans to retain those talents. In Europe, I talk to a lot of talent and HR in large companies whose stock has plummeted. And they're like, most of our employees don't realize that their equity is not worth anything at the moment. So it's interesting.
How interesting. So you're saying that essentially the level of ignorance I want to use is the dictionary definition. So I don't want to mean this pejoratively, but basically the general ignorance of how equity works is actually served as a retaining factor for European candidates or employees because they're not entirely sure what it all means. Whereas I think in the US it's just a little bit more like the fluent with the concept of getting equity as part of the comp package, whereas in Europe, I think for a lot of people are first timers. They're joining startup for the first time. You get a big thing, you think, okay, that's fine, and don't quite know what it means. And by the way, it can be very difficult there's a tax implication for a lot of folks about this. And I know people, you and I know people, Virgil, that have been really hammered by essentially not quite understanding where the tax sort of calculation takes place in terms of what you owe to the state based on whether you get your grant or when you actually exercise it. And that can actually lead you to be impoverished. Forget about sort of your compensation. It can be a devastating amount. So the education on equity definitely needs to improve.
And one thing there, Hang, is like quick thing I often do sessions or classes for like startup employees, 100 or so. And every time I like, okay, raise your hand. Nearly all of them have received stock options, right? Raise your hand if you're 100% sure that you know how a stock option actually works. And there's every time at most 20 to 25% of people raising their hand. It's the impact, the understanding of stock option within people that actually hold and own stock option is vastly overestimated. This is why the retention impact is still there and the attraction impact of a company being like, hey, we're giving you 40K of equity. And most candidates are like, whoa, nice. Whether they don't even realize that it's a form of stock option, company that has overvalued with the likelihood of the stock option being worth anything, being super small. Most people still don't realize that.
Yeah, Neil, I'm going to bring you in here in a sec, but I just one final point on this is that I observed US candidates actually renegotiating with their employers based on the decline of the market price of their company and saying, I took this job on the proviso that it will be up here, and it's now down here. My total comp is like this now. So you need to increase my guaranteed basic salary or whatever. I don't think that conversation is really happening in Europe at all. And maybe it's got it'll obviously have something to do with the wider perception of insecurity in the market out there, even though we know that if you're a tech person, as in a software engineer, probably you're still quite well insulated, but it's still not as good a market for even those folks than it was in the past. Longer basically decision-making processes. The comp isn't particularly on the same trend as it was, so they get the sense that it's not as friendly as it was. So maybe they're not moving as actively as they were before. Neil, you got any thoughts on the equity side? I mean, what's your
I mean, listen to Virgil, kind of my one thought is, do we do enough kind of cultural thinking about the impact of different forms of remuneration in different countries? I think one of the challenges in tech is that the tech bros, used in Hung's non-pejorative definition, like ignorance. Yeah, I've had quite a lot of experience with the big kind of West Coast tech firms when they came into Europe and tried to change things in the employment world. And the kind of takeaway is that the mindset in leadership in lots of those firms is, this is the way the world is, and you're going to roll with it. And actually, when it comes to remuneration, particularly in Europe, that really isn't how the world is. So one of the things to encourage in firms is, well, if you've got a set budget for things you want to do, equity clearly is a driver in the US. If it's not a driver in Europe, do you educate or do you offer something else? And you're both valid points. You might want to persist with stock options and educate. You might want to do something else. I've seen a little version of this actually play out in just for light relief, Hung, in the recruitment industry in the UK, not with stock options, but with commission. Where there's definitely some evidence of consultants saying, well, my commission's not as high because the market's poor, so can you put my base salary up? Which has got precisely the kind of robust response from the firm as you might expect. But I do think underlying that there's a serious point, which is, if you look at a complex service, and I think recruitment is increasingly a complex service, do you really want to be remunerating people in that lone wolf way? So I keep coming back to, it's for firms to think about their structure and what works for them, and not kind of hold to what they've always done. This feels like a moment to step back. You mentioned earlier the kind of data and strategy that Virgil and the team are putting together. I think stepping back and thinking, where do I want to be in this market as an HR lead is really, really important.
That's actually a really good point. I mean, let's move on to this.
Don't sound so surprised.
Yeah, it was stunning, Neil. Constantly, it's like, what's he on about? No, the comp in HR and TA, because we have this really weird relationship with all of this, because not only are we people that kind of have to sell jobs and have to work with money internally and what have you, but of course we're also individual workers that are part of this story as well. So we have to get these two hats on our head sometimes, as to how it all works. So I think there's two things we need to cover here before we finish this conversation. Number one, what is our advice or recommendations for companies looking at compensation into 2024 for the organization in order to stay competitive? And secondly, how do we think about it for ourselves? So in other words, like, do we want to try and change the way in which HRTA are paid? So for instance, you're talking about the variable component of compensation for TA internally. I don't think there's a big component that is variable. Do we want to introduce that? Is now a moment to rethink? Okay, let's do this. Or do we keep it far away and say, actually, no, we comp it in some other fashion? Folks, if you're listening to this, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Have you thought about maybe a more significant kind of jig around as to how compensation looks, rather than just leaving it up or down? I mean, what are your thoughts? Neil, let's go with you on this as we're talking about it. With the sorts of so Neil kind of runs a big industry body of recruitment agency owners. So what are you seeing in terms of compensation, in terms of how recruiters on the agencies are being comped?
So I'm seeing a big move away from lone wolf pay, and a big move towards different measures, different KPIs. And if you think about that, increasingly, especially if you're servicing big client, recruitment's a team game. That's not necessarily moving away from that kind of 360 world where your consultant does everything to having team specialists. But the behaviors you want to encourage are a bit more collaborative than maybe they were 10, 15 years ago. So we're definitely seeing more team-based comp coming through in the recruitment industry. We're also seeing some thinking about benefits, and there definitely seems to be a live debate going on about there being more lines in the bargain over reward than just pay. For instance, there's obviously the hybrid is a debate is an important one, but we've got a member who's moved to a 9-day fortnight, and that's working really well for them as a retention tool. So there are lots of things you can do that offset pay, benefits, working time, and they will differ from firms to firms, but the liveliest firms in our sector appear to be thinking much more proactively about that and not getting stuck with what they've always done before. In terms of internal TA, I think it's really difficult to do flexible reward on a short-term basis for TA in companies. If your turnover spikes, it might have nothing to do with your TA team. But I think you can do some long-term stuff, and maybe we should be thinking about long-term incentive plans if what we want to do is retain TA teams to build campaigns on employer brand and positioning over time.
Yeah, and I think maybe the movement of, let's say, team-based commissions, I think that's what you're talking about, Neil. Maybe that migrates into TA in a more significant way. So, I can envisage a situation where TA gets rewarded or remunerated in a team-based way. Let's say, let's increase our overall, candidate NPS score or something. You hit this number, and everyone triggers some sort of comp back at you. Those types of measures, I think, could be quite an interesting way to try and lever things around. Again, folks, let me know whether there's anything creative happening in your business in terms of how TA are paid. Is it a case everyone's just got flat salary? That's how it is. Let's review once a year. Or are there other kind of accelerator components that can kind of promote behavior? Virgil, do you have any granularity on this? I don't think you do you? In terms of, maybe you do, job family wise. What's going on data wise for HRTA in the data you have?
I don't think I have. We could have a look at what we have, like zooming in on like variable pay for HR and TA. I'm not sure how much we have there, but what I'm 100% sure that we see in the data, and that personally I believe in, is clearly most companies are moving away from individual variable pay for all roles. Like some roles is just going away, like variable pay for tech companies, for tech people, first of all. Like if anyone listening to us right now says, yes, variable pay and bonuses work super well for our tech team, I'd love to hear it. I keep hearing companies saying it doesn't work. And overall, what we see is companies are moving away from individual variable pay because it's inefficient, right? On paper, it looks super good. On paper, the idea of like incentivizing someone's performance is amazing. In reality, right, it's like, it's tough to attract people with variable pay. And when I was at Criteo, right, for 3 years, I saw this. We had high variable pay component, including for tech. We had people being like, they were on a 50K salary. We were like, okay, we're giving you 52K plus 10K of variable pay. They were like, no. Variable pay is not guaranteed to me. I only look for base pay, so I want 55 or I'm not signing. So those people were getting what? 55 plus 10, because we couldn't remove variable pay from their package. Then it doesn't motivate most people. Even I'm not a huge fan of generation X, Y, Z stuff, but still generationally, it's not a huge driver to people, even on sales roles, right? If you look at like 15 years ago, it used to be that sales were like 30% base salary and 70% commissions. The more we progress, the more people want a strong base salary and like 30% in variable pay or commission. So yeah, we're moving away from individual variable pay. And I think this will keep on going with the spike in interest rates. Why? If you're going to the bank tomorrow, you want to make a loan to buy an apartment or something, the bank will be like, hey, your variable pay, we don't take it into consideration in what your income. So like essentially most companies are transferring this historical individual variable pay into base salary or team commissions and team bonuses and stuff like that. And I think this trend will keep going. I don't foresee it changing in the next few years. And in fact, I see it more and more variable pay, more base pay, more salary, less and less individual variable pay. It's not attractive. It's not particularly motivating to most people. It's a mess to manage for companies and managers. So I think this is a trend that will keep going on.
That's really, really interesting. And I think the mortgage issue is one of the key things that just, dropped into my mind when you mention it, Virgil. It's like, okay, it's more than just the absolute numbers that you bring in once a year. There's other things that depend on the guaranteed aspect, particularly in more insecure environments. Then, the commission needs to be pushed away. Very good point by Paula in the chat there. What about the sort of share of revenue? I think, didn't John Lewis in the UK used to do share of revenue or something like this? I wonder whether, again, let's think creatively. Has anyone even thought about this? So you do, okay, profit share across the business, maybe one of the ways in which you could put a variable rate component in, but everyone is really in it together. Like, kind of you want the company to succeed, and therefore you do more than just your job, and you would encourage other people to do more than just their job, because it helps with the overall profit making side. Do I see an example of that? I'd love to hear it. Let me know in the chat, folks. Visually,
Yeah, and I think before Neil jumps on this one, there's a scheme in France for profit sharing and company-wide profit sharing scheme. Those ones we've seen increase in popularity, exactly for the reason you stated. Instead of defining non-motivating, not superly attractive individual variable pay that are a mess to manage, company-wide, hey guys, if we win, we all win, right? Type of stuff. Those type of stuff we see a rise in popularity, and I think I 100% believe in it, for sure. Over to Neil.
And John Lewis in the UK, of course, is employee owned, and we've definitely seen a trend amongst smaller agencies in the UK in our membership, moving as the founder exits into employee ownership, which delivers exactly that kind of structure. I think a little bit of profit sharing going on. I do think I think the causality is the other way around. People don't work harder because there's a profit share. If there's a profit share, they tend to be more switched on to the health of the business. So in some ways, it's about them understanding which things have impact. So it's more complex than a simple motivation framework. And I think if we understand that, you can start to see those kinds of things as maybe having more of a future. I mean, I'm really fascinated in what Virgil said about the shift to base pay. I think that's what I see too. And I think it's what you're always going to see in a higher inflation environment, because the appetite amongst employees to take risk is much lower now that inflation's north of 5% and their credit card APR is in the 30s.
Yeah, like we all feel it in the wallet. I think that's one of the main things that's different from, because sometimes economics can feel very abstract, but this is when it kind of really hits us at the level of the street, and we all kind of need to have an opinion on it. Let's talk about flexi working. Neil, you touched on this, shift to remote, hybrid working, etc. Are we starting to see this change compensation in some way? I think we had the sort of the maximalist position really strongly argued maybe two some years ago, before the cost of living crisis really came in, where we said, you know what, we're going to pay everyone San Francisco salaries no matter where you live. This is the only way. We started to deny the sort of reality of cost of living at that point. But have we now got to the point where actually, no, that's, we can't do that? It's more a case of, look, we have to do location adjusted. And where are we with this? So remote location adjustment, and also things like doing less work, a 4-day week. Where are we with this? Are we still paying a 5-day? Can we start talking about, actually, I want to do 2 days? And then does that, do I crunch down pro rata my salary? Are we starting to see those examples? So remote work first, location adjustment, has that changed from 2022, 2023, where you see it 2024? Neil, thoughts?
I think it has changed. I think the idea that you can have a global salary for a job is kind of unsupportable unless your strategy is basically to move into low-cost countries. And if that's your strategy, you should be honest with yourself about it. I do think it's within jurisdictions, it's squeezing a bit. I don't think we can expect the idea of people to be paid people being paid differently in London, Manchester and Holyhead in the UK to stick around for very long, especially if we're especially driven by the interaction with hybrid, because frankly, if you only have to come to the office in London 2 days a week, you can commute from anywhere. Basically, anywhere south of Edinburgh is commutable in that world. So from I think the offset of hybrid and the pay position means, and indeed the effect of equal pay law will mean that within jurisdictions there'll be a greater leveling out. But actually, I think that's just ironing out things that were already there. There have always been greater disparities in pay in the UK within regions than there are between regions. You know, go back to the Scottish Independence campaign of 2014, and then the Yes campaign was saying compare wages in the East End of Glasgow with wages in Kensington and Chelsea in London, and you look at it and go, yeah, but compare wages in the East End of Glasgow with wages in Milngavie and Bearsden in Glasgow. There have always been these gaps in compensation regionally. I think those will start to iron out a bit more, but very much within jurisdiction.
Yeah, very interesting. Thoughts on this, Virgil? Location, hybrid, remote, the impact of this, how's it changed?
So first of all, the idea, and I wrote something last week on that, right? The idea is that paying everyone the same salaries regardless of location being the new norm or whatever in tech, for example, is not true, right? When we look at our data, we see that 93 companies are still basing their compensation based on the employee's location, whether it's at city or the country level, as to Neil was saying. What we do see is more of a normalization at the country level, as Neil was saying, right? It used to be very specific to location. So, for example, the gap between London and the rest of UK, or the gap between Paris and the rest of France, keeps shrinking. Like compensation is normalizing at a country level instead of the historical norm that has existed since the beginning of time, which was at the city level, right? The markets used to be defined at the city level, it's more and more at the country level. The idea that it's a global market because everyone are paying San Francisco rates is not true at all. Not true at all. We see it normalizing per country. And yeah, getting closer. I didn't mention Germany because Germany is very specific, right? The UK and France are quite centralized, Paris and London, and then the rest of the country. Germany is very different when there's like the salaries in Berlin, in Munich, and like Hamburg and so on are very hyper localized. So this notion of a German market is a bit not true. But yeah, this is what we're saying. No, the normalization of global pay, not true at all. 93% of companies are localizing pay as per the employee location, but we are going from a city-based market to a country-based market when it comes to compensation.
That's really interesting. And that ultimately is, I think, an impact, obviously, of the shift to remote stroke hybrid, in the sense that the rationale of paying broadly differently as being chipped away. The argument, I think, is very, very strong that the job is being done. Yes, I'm in time zone. I'm in the same jurisdiction from a fiscal point of view. There's no reason why you'd be paid significantly less it is a slightly different place in a global context. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's final thing we want to move on to, because it segues on to our next sort of a final series, actually, which is on pay transparency. What's happening on the legislation side that has an impact on compensation that the folks at home need to be aware of? What are the things that are driving a lot of the changes that you see? Neil, you want to go ahead first with this one?
So I think there are a couple of things. Fairly generally now in the developed economies, there's an acceptance that minimum wage rates can be ramped. Because we've had big experiments in lots of jurisdictions. So I expect to see politicians continuing to make big promises on minimum wages. So if you're affected by that part of the sector, I think that will continue to happen until such time that there's then there's a little bit more of an offset against employment in some of these high employment, low unemployment jurisdictions. Secondly, watch what's happening with equal pay law. Now, it's pretty broken in lots of countries because things take ages to work their way through the court. But certainly in the UK, where equal pay law is still basically the same as that's mandated by the Equal Treatment Directive, which covers all the EU member states, it's fairly clear that location is getting less and less defensible as a reason to pay people differently. Most obviously, out of town, dark warehouses run by supermarkets where the majority of the workforce are male, and in town, lighter supermarkets where the majority of workers are female, they are being equaled off. Birmingham City Council has gone bust. It's gone bust because it didn't pay its dinner ladies the same as its in the same way as its refuse collectors. Those are two different jobs, but they were deemed to be of the same value. So watch that equal pay law and what that effect might be. And then the third thing, Hung, is transparency, where I just think we're going to have progressively more pressure on transparency about pay, and we see that on gender pay gap reporting. We will see it on ethnicity pay gap reporting. And that's going to create a process of work for HR and TA teams.
Yeah, and on the ethnicity side, that's something's happening in the UK for this, isn't it? Where companies are going to have to start publishing ethnicity pay data or something. Is that right, Neil?
Yeah, over time, and it's something we actually already do at the REC. But the difference with gender pay reporting, where you can where you have a small number of trans people probably on your staff, and you can just ask them how they want to be counted. Ethnicity is something where you first have to establish what your members of staff say they are. And I'll give you a trite and close to home example. I personally do not like being called white British. I'm white Scottish, but there are all sorts of flavors. And the biggest hole I've seen companies fall into is using lists of ethnicities drawn from America and the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
and things
100%.
like that. There's lots of tripwires, and all of this is about it is a process, but that process has to involve your people. So as ever, employment relations and talking to your people about this stuff really matters.
You just convinced me to do Brain Food Live on transracialism, because I think that's going to be a D&I issue in the coming years. As you say, people can assert their identity, and we're already starting to see people that make a strong claim to say, I actually do identify as this ethnicity. I identify as that, and it's very hard to argue against, as a matter of fact, because how are you going to police that situation without literally diving into the genomics of it, which generally speaking, we're not comfortable to do. So we're going to start seeing some very interesting things occur as a lot of these kind of cultural, as cultures change. The categories that we previously used to do segmentation on populations are no longer as discrete as they were before, and they're no longer as they're negotiable, basically. So you can negotiate your entry into certain groups. That's going to be a very interesting phenomenon to be aware of. And we as HR and TA people have to kind of be ahead of the curve on this, irrespective of your personal opinions. So all of that needs to be thought through. Virgil, final word to you on pay transparency and the legislative environment overall. How is that affecting comp going forward for all of us here?
This is one lots of impact, right? So the way I don't think I'm exaggerating when I'm thinking that we are about to move into a new era of pay transparency laws, right? It used to be, I like to think that it used to be in a black box era, right? For any employee out there, am I being treated fairly compared to my peers in the company? Can't really know. Maybe I can ask some of the colleagues. Am I being paid market rates? Can't really know either, right? Is my company treating people and men and women fairly? Now we've been still seeing some laws, especially in the UK, has been quite progressive on that to help bring some clarity. But it was very much a black box for most people, right? Pay transparency laws, European directive on pay transparency, and the UK will release some laws specific to it as well, are going to push that into the forefront, right? Into the light. Companies will have to share their gender pay gap. Company will have to share with each employee. Each employee will be able to request to the company, how am I paid compared to my peers? How am I paid compared to the external market? Salary ranges will start to be more and more displayed on job ads. So you will have a view on your market value by looking at competitors' salary ranges on their job ads. This will shift completely the dynamic of the conversation because people will have access to the information. And so that will change a lot of things when it comes to compensation. This will put a lot of stress on companies to adapt, because a lot of the inequalities they've been able to hide for years and put under the carpet will be exposed. So one of the things there's going to be many impacts, right? And we can talk 1 hour on that. And I think maybe one of the webinars on the series are dedicated to that. But one aligned with one of the things we said is I think the budget for fixing inequality in each company are going to be larger and larger and larger, because companies don't want to get into this new world and have to share some of the inequalities, share a awful gender pay gap, share that people on the same role are being paid worlds apart. So a lot of companies are going to be working internally to fix those inequalities the next year or two. So budget for inequality fixing are going to be increased by a lot in the next year or two by companies who don't want to be exposed pretty soon in this new era of pay transparency.
Yeah, I think very good point. It's it's a project of work, isn't it? It has to be super important because it will have huge impact to your morale of your business at some point. If you've kind of had an opaque salary structure and there's a big reveal, dude, that can be extraordinarily damaging to your company culture. And of course, the messaging externally, when that is exposed, is going to be really destructive also. If it's explicitly up there, people are going to look at that data. They're going to forget about Glassdoor to a large degree and say, you know what? We can actually see what the pay difference is here on this regard. So I think a big job of work for everybody on the compliment side. Okay, folks, we need to move on. Let's have a look at the poll results. I think they're all in. All of this is worth reviewing. So, by the way, Nick, can people actually see the poll results live? If not, I think they can. So, but I'll read them out anyway in case you can't. So the first poll is, okay, regarding employee benefits, which trend has been most prominent in 2023? We had a number of options. By far and away, 57% of you have said the benefits packages becoming what? I actually can't read the rest of this, but benefits packages are becoming what?
More comprehensive.
More comprehensive. So in other words, we're being more creative with the comp packages, and we're doing more than just the pay. We have to think wider about what people are provisioning. Maybe sort of flexi working and stuff like that is kind of wrapped into the Ben side of it as well. Okay, second poll result here. Is your company planning higher or lower budget increases than last year? Interesting enough, it's quite kind of split. The most popular vote was 53%. Don't know yet. Folks, it's September already. So why don't we know? Probably, maybe the company doesn't know. Maybe it's going down. Maybe it's right. If it's
I think I'm surprised by that. Anything we've seen so far seems to hint that we have lower budgets this year than we had last year.
Yeah, it's going down, but they haven't articulated it. And finally, compensation for TA and recruiters, has it leveled off or increased? Is leveled off 62%. It's decreased by 38%. We probably could have done with has it increased, but presumably it's we know it's looking less positive than it has done. Peak was 2021. We're in a bit of a trough. We're probably going to be troughing away. Maybe this is the new normal for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. Okay, folks, that's about it. Thank you so much for watching this a wonderful conversation. I hope you've really enjoyed it. We are going to keep rolling. I think we've got another one in 2 weeks' time. It's going to be super interesting. It's one of the shows I wanted to do for a long time. And this is, has AI impacted compensation levels? And if so, how? So in other words, there's multiple ways we can think about this. Firstly, calculation-wise, have anybody used AI to calculate comp? Maybe we should. We shouldn't get a manager to magic up the number. Can we use artificial intelligence to actually help us do the calculation on what the appropriate compensation would be and what is the optimal compensation for the people we want to hire for? Second thing, has AI actually influenced the sort of skills that we value? So for instance, we're talking about what skills are going to be disintermediated by AI. Has that suppressed the demand for it? Have companies adopted the IPM position and said, you know what, actually, I think we're going to get AI to replace those folks in future. Maybe we don't hire those people. If we do, certainly compensation shouldn't be right up there. And lots of really interesting things to talk about. Finally, what are we doing in terms of AI skills, AI enablement of the business? Are we hiring at a higher level for these folks in terms of compensation? Do we want to spend more money to attract that in? That's happening in 2 weeks' time, folks. Make sure you join that webinar. I believe Megan or Nick will send you an email for the registration link for that. That's already live. We'll see you in that in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much for joining, everyone. Neil, Carberry, thank you very much for joining. Virgil, always a pleasure. We'll see you all next time.
See you, everyone.